So I found myself without the ability to use the really rich oral histories that had been collected. And so rather than trying to do something just based on my notes, which would not have done justice to the knowledge that had been shared, I went back and thought about what else could I do for my thesis. And I had done a lot of reading of explorers' journals and anthropology, and Rasmussen and Nassenbalixi and everybody else who'd written about the North. And one of the things that had struck me was how much people moved. And I didn't mean seasonal rounds. I meant lengthy population movements. And here again, I think I have to go back to Tata Marie. I have to go back to Father Guy Mary-Rousselière, who had done this amazing piece of work that he couldn't get published, called Cri de l'Archois, l'histoire d'une migration polaire, which followed the history of Cri de l'Archois. And who must have been an incredible man. I mean, this guy must have had charisma, because he moved, he had grown up somewhere in the area of what was later on called Broughton Island. He then had moved up towards Pont Inlet Mitimatalik. He had committed murders, and yet he was able to convince a group of people to travel with him because of a vision that he'd had to all the way up, up the coast of Ellesmere Island, over to North Greenland, to the polar Inuit, to the Inuit. So this was an amazing history, and Father Mary had done these incredible interviews with people and had the entire genealogies. But what struck me was that there were so many of these migrations that if you looked into the literature, if you were looking for them, there they were. People talking about times when the whole community had got up and moved. Not because it was springtime and it was time to go to the flow edge to hunt walrus, or it was summer and you were going to hunt caribou, but because of some catastrophic event that had happened to the community, either somebody who'd been exiled and had taken a chunk of the community, or the population had grown too large in one area, the land had become, the Inuit expression is too hot. The land had become too hot. And so the people had moved to an entirely new area. Well, how often did that happen? What does that mean? What does that mean for our interpretation of Inuit history over time? These kinds of population movements. And did these kinds of population movements actually link to what we refer to as what archaeologists refer to as the Thule migration, which is the migration of the ancestors of the Inuit into the north? Right, so this a migration that occurred around AD 1100, let's say, and is one of the reasons why Inuktitut, why people who speak Inuktitut can understand from North Alaska to Greenland. So what do these kinds of different population movements that are not attached to seasonal rounds, what do they mean, and can we see them, could we see them in the archaeological record, and how would we even go about that? So the first part of my thesis was about these population movements and documenting these population movements, and I think there's something like 17 major movements that I was able to document in the thesis to show that these weren't random occurrence. I mean, I don't mean that they're planned, but that they happen relatively frequently, right? And that they could have major demographic impacts when a population moves from where there was their home into somewhere completely different. Then they're also changing the dynamics of the population that they bump into. So there were all these interesting impacts that were going on. So that was one part of the thesis. And then I moved on to looking at some of the ideas that were coming out of the work of Martin Vobst, Polly Wiesner at the time, which were about style and about the way that people signal identity. So were there markers among the Inuit that signaled identity that we could find in the archaeological record? Because Wiesner and Vobst's work was primarily looking at clothing as signaling. Right? And finding clothing in the archaeological record is it's a relatively rare occurrence, so we had to be looking at things. So for the second part of the thesis, what I actually did was I looked at material culture collections in museums that were collected by people like Mathiasen and Rasmussen, so not archaeological collections and diamond jeunesse, but collections that were made from living communities, so we knew where they came from. So we knew which area of Nunavut they came from. And actually it was a larger than that, so it would be more Nunangat. It would be more, because I looked at collections from Nunavik, northern Quebec, from Nunatsiavut, from Labrador as well. And it was looking at those collections and saying, are they distinct enough? Are there items, pieces of material culture that show differences between the different groups? And then, by extension, could we take that into the archaeological record? And so the work that I did was to show that, yes, actually you could. So I looked at snow goggles, combs, lamps, and harpoon heads, because I didn't want to only look at things that men used. I wanted to also look at things that were that women used as well, because this was also at the same time as Ian Hodder. So I was at Cambridge as a graduate student. Ian Hodder had an amazing cohort of graduate students that I was not part of. I mean, they were my colleagues and my friends, but I wasn't one of his students. And they were doing incredible ethnoarchaeology field work in Mali, in Kenya, in the Sudan, just really stunning work where they were looking at exactly these kinds of behaviors, but also looking at the issues of when people move, who's moving in a marriage and what kinds of material culture are they taking with them? And when you take that material culture with you, when I move, if I'm a woman and I move to my husband's community, do I change the way I've made my pottery all my life? Do I take on board the style of there, or do I bring my heritage, my style, my family with me? And they were looking at some of those questions. So I was looking at both things that men and women used. So I did that for that, and showed that yes, you could, but actually it's really difficult. It is challenging. So I'm not certain how well it would actually play out in the archaeological record. So that was my thesis. And I again found myself in one of these amazing positions that at the end of my thesis, where I applied for a postdoc at the Smithsonian Institution. I'd had this, I found that working with the material culture was really something that I enjoyed. And it was interesting at that time, not a lot of anthropologists were doing material culture studies, right? It was like, oh, that's passé. You know, we used to do that in the 19th century. We don't do that anymore. And yet, as an archaeologist coming out of archaeology, then turning and looking at these collections that were made that had, you know, living makers behind them, that had these rich histories behind them, I'm like, wow, there's so much here, and I would love to work more with these. So I applied for a postdoc at the Smithsonian, and I started working with Bill Fitzhugh at the Smithsonian, and I got to go to Labrador and work with him on Labrador sites. And that's one of the times where I remember a story where you always have to remember that the people that you're talking to may be coming from a completely different perspective than you are. And we arrived at this, we were in a small boat, and we arrived at this site, had amazing beach ridges, maritime archaic, 6,000, 7,000-year-old long houses that you could see laid out on these beach ridges. There's a tiny little hut, and there's a guy living in this tiny little hut. And he was very welcoming, and we had a wonderful time with him. And I was talking with him, and he came up and he was looking at this longhouse. He said, "So how old do you think this is?" And I said, I don't know. I mean, but I think it's about 6,000, 7,000 years old. He looked at me and said, "No, you're wrong. You're wrong. The world is only 4,000 years old, right? That's when God created the world. We know that as a fact." And I'm sitting there going, okay. So here's an entirely different perspective. Here's somebody who is very much actually he was a very strong Pentecostal believer, and it was like, how do I explain what I'm doing here and this work, which doesn't fit into his worldview at all. So that was also another really interesting experience, which then is something that has helped me again later on in my life, thinking back to that kind of an experience, to the work that I now do in a museum, and work that has to do with knowledge mobilization, with taking the knowledge that's gained through research by archaeologists and anthropologists and work of community members, and how do you disseminate that to a broader public who may be bringing an entirely different perspective to bear, for whom something like that is so far outside of what they're used to. So you never know when those kinds of experiences are going to come out. And I think all of us involved in field work have those kinds of experiences where you just go, "Oh, okay, wow, this is not what I'm used to. This is not my world. And how do I engage with this person in a way that's meaningful for them?" And so trying to show him and not turning around saying, "Well, you're wrong," right? But gently trying to show that there are different ways of thinking about things. So I worked with Bill Fitzhugh and the crew at the Smithsonian for a number of years. And that was the first time that I actually got to work on museum exhibits. And I worked for, after I did my postdoc at the Smithsonian, I worked for Joellen Archambault, who was one of the curators at the Smithsonian. And when I worked for her, she was one of the first hires of an Indigenous curator at the National Museum of Natural History. So this is before the days of the National Museum of the American Indian. This is 1987, 88. And she actually had me go and sit down in the halls, which had been done. This is the old anthropology halls in the National Museum of Natural History on the Mall in Washington, D.C. She actually had me sit down in the halls and look at the way that visitors were engaging with. So I wasn't doing anything fancy. I wasn't doing visitor surveys. I wasn't doing tracking exercises. All I was doing was observing visitors. And I was watching them. They had an exhibit that had been done in the 50s that had taken some very old 19th century life groups that had been done for World's Fairs, that were these full-size plaster casts. One of them was of a Hopi snake dance, right? A very important ceremony. And there it was in life-size plaster casts behind a glass wall. And of course these plaster casts of people who were living people at the time, and then they have the rattlesnakes in their mouths, which is a really important part of this ceremony. And I was sitting in the hallways watching people go by, and you could see high school groups going by on, and every single time almost somebody would go, "Ooh, that's so disgusting," right? Or looking at that and othering it. right? Which is what we talk about in anthropology, this, how do we get away? How do we break away from this sense of othering people? And so based on that experience and other people's comments about that space, we actually worked on redoing that space. So that was also interesting to me to see how museums could create these spaces that did other people, did take Indigenous people and put them behind glass boxes, and we'll talk about Michael Ames in a bit, but so that sense of distancing, of creating them as being not the same as us. We, the visitor, us, who, when those museums were set up, were a relatively small, and still are, if you look at the people that go to museums, demographic, and that this was not a way that worked. So we actually worked with the Hopi to talk about how we could deal with it. So we did a very simple remix. They've redone everything since then, but at the time, just to deal with the situation, we actually very simply covered over the glass case and put images on front that were selected by the Hopi community that talked a little bit about their lives. And that sounds so obvious, right? It sounds so obvious, but you have to remember this. We're now talking about the late 80s, early 90s. It was not so obvious back in those days, and people like Joe Allen and other people at the Smithsonian were really forethinking about the kinds of work that they were doing. Another really important, very tiny exhibit, which I believe has been written about by someone, was a little tiny exhibit that I got to be part of at the Smithsonian. It was another one of those cases in that same space that we took out. And there was a Seminole collection at the Smithsonian. And William Sturdivant, an amazing anthropologist, had been one of the collectors of that collection and knew it well. And so what we actually arranged for was the people I was working for. I was their research assistant. So Joe Allen and others arranged, and Bill Sturdivant, we put out the collection, the whole collection. And Bill Sturdivant came in and he selected 30 pieces from the collection. Right? And then we also invited a couple from the Seminole called the Tiger Tails to come in, and they, without knowing what he'd selected, they selected 30 pieces from the collection to talk about their history. And then we actually put the two together, and they talked about why each had selected what they'd selected. And from that we created a small exhibit. And what was really fascinating was, so for example, one of the pieces was a small canoe made for sale at a tourist stall. Not selected by Bill Sturdivant because it was made for sale at a tourist stall, right? Right? So you can see why. And, but selected by the Tiger Tails, because it showed how they used to move through Florida, right? Through their homelands, that the canoe was an important mechanism for them for transportation through the swamps of Florida. So it was very interesting to see the different, and there were things that they picked that were the same, but to see these differences and to see the pieces through the lenses of Sturdivant, seeing it one way and interpreting it as not so much not having value because it was made for sale on a tourist stand and wasn't necessarily exactly how a canoe would look. And to the Tiger Tails, that this was standing in as a representative of a very important aspect of their heritage and their culture. So I got to do a lot of fun, small experimental exhibits like that at the time that were just phenomenal opportunities to look at material culture, heritage in a different way. And I was just so lucky to be able to do that. And as part of that employment, they were also planning to redo the anthropology halls. So these were the minor rejiggings that we were doing prior to a major refit of they were going to gut the exhibits and redo them entirely. That never happened because the National Museum of the American Indian happened instead. So, but we were working on it and working with communities and talking about what are some of the things that were important to them. And the themes that they came up with at that time are actually themes that have then gone through my whole working career. So there was the idea of collaboration and the collaborative model, which was there right from the start of my very first work with Father Guy Mary-Rousselière, but has then continued on in a trajectory in my life, and that sort of helped solidify that. Also hearing from different Indigenous communities that we talked to as part of that project, and then the idea of continuity was the other major one, that communities said, so often when people come into a museum and see these things, they look at them and they think, oh, that's beautiful, too bad the people aren't here today. Right? It's as if through the myth of the vanishing Indian, we created the vanishing, we vanished the Indian. And by the way that things are put on display, by the third person labels that we use, by the past tense that is used in labels, we are again creating we're othering in a different way and sort of saying it, and so people go away with the impression that Indigenous communities aren't living, thriving communities, and we want to get away from that. And so that was really another important lesson that I took away from that work. And I think I said Joellen Archambault, but I meant Joellen Arsenault. So I better just make clear that, because they're very different people, one works here and the other one works at the Smithsonian. So, yeah. So that's just a little bit about that aspect of the work that I did at the Smithsonian before I actually then ended up in Edmonton.